Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was in Washington, D.C. this week for U.S. President Donald Trump's inauguration. And according to one source that we have on the ground, the Trump administration is noticing the Alberta Premier might be being criticized here in Canada for an apparent lack of a Team Canada approach. That is not at all the reception that she is receiving in Washington, where she is being found to be the only person who's taking the Americans' concerns seriously. And that could be a very good thing from Canada. Today, we'll be hearing from one source on the ground, a former special advisor to Jason Kenney, who explains how Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is being received in Washington. And later, we'll be joined by Alberta's mental health and addictions minister for an update on Alberta's recovery model. I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to The Rachel Parker Show. Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to The Rachel Parker Show. I am joined by David Knight Legg, a former principal advisor to the former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, as well as a founding CEO and advisor to Invest Alberta. David, thank you so much for being here today. I've been seeing all of your content on X and, of course, your many op-eds in the National Post, and you've really been dominating on this issue of the trade war with Alberta Danielle Smith. And I want to start by asking you, I know that you're in Washington for the inauguration. How is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith perceived in Washington?
Look, she's very well liked here. I'm not part of the Alberta delegation, have to be clear about that. She's here under, and this should be said, she's here under the jurisdiction that Canada's federalist structure has in place, which is she's responsible for the energy that comes from Alberta, that belongs to Alberta. She's speaking on behalf of Alberta's interests in this issue that's come up, which is that the president, out of frustration with the lack of security and the breakdown in security on the northern border, has raised this issue of tariffs, and energy is a third of our export GDP into the United States. So she's here representing that. I've spoken with people at the State Department. I have a couple of friends that are joining the administration in senior roles, and she's well regarded, and that's why she's getting meetings. You've probably seen her X. I mean, she's met with Burgum, Wright, Rubio, several other cabinet ministers socially. She's really taking the time, making the effort. And by the way, this is the inauguration weekend. Those are very hard meetings for anyone to get. You've got over 100 countries here, notably with most of federal Canadian politicians MIA, but over 100 countries here hoping to get a chance to talk to just one or two, often secondary people in the Trump administration in order to make sure that their voice is heard and that the interests of their country or their jurisdiction is understood early on. And that they're seen to be, celebrating the moment of this administration transition. And somehow in Canada, the narrative has become very unusual, and Canada's sort of acting in a resentful manner towards the idea of these tariffs. Whereas the Mexicans, for instance, are very, very focused on making sure that they address the border issues directly and show that they're addressing them. So that contrast to me between what you see in the Canadian press, what you see on CBC with people like Jagmeet Singh talking about everything being on the table, or the post that got me posting on X, which was my old friend Andrew Coyne, saying she's on an appeasement crusade. I just feel like I had to speak about that. I'm not speaking in a formal capacity from Alberta. Danielle's got a great team and she's doing a terrific job, but I thought as somebody pretty objective, I could say what I thought about it. And I think she's doing a terrific job representing Alberta.
So your contacts in Washington, D.C., including some who are entering the Trump administration, are noticing that dichotomy of Alberta's premier who is wanting to address the Americans' concerns and build those relationships versus the response of the rest of the country and certain of the federal government, which, as you said, seems to be one of resentment. Washington is picking up on that.
Yeah, 100%. Look, you can't not pick up on it, right? The things that some Canadian politicians think they're doing in private are well known by people in influence here because they're paying attention, especially the people whose job it is to pay attention to these things. People forget, back when we were negotiating the USMCA agreement, Canada was kicked out of the room by Bob Lighthizer because Chrystia Freeland decided to go on stage in Toronto and also to say out loud that she thought Trump was a dictator. She went on a stage about Putin, Xi, and Trump with some left-wing organization. And following that, she was asked, Lighthizer wouldn't meet with her. That's why she had to do that, sort of meeting at her home with Lighthizer after the deal got done. Mexico and the United States did a bilateral deal, and Canada had only a couple weeks to join the USMCA after Mexico and the United States had already resolved a massive bilateral trade deal. And that was simply because Freeland at the time was trying to dine out on the fact that within the Liberal Party of Canada, their ideology, Trump was considered a bad guy. And so she was trying to score political points domestically on that fact, rather than doing a principal job, which was securing the best deal. Now, fortunately, we had great people within the Liberal Party, guys like David McNaughton, who was the ambassador to Canada, to the United States from Canada at the time. And, he did a phenomenal job here and is well regarded here. And you hear about that. So, I have friends in the Trump administration that know who David McNaughton is. They know how hard he worked for Canada. So this doesn't have to be a partisan thing. It has to be a tactical thing. And I will say this, Danielle Smith is flying a Canadian flag. The principal argument she's been making, it's very important for people to know this, the principal argument that she's been making is that oil and gas, a third of our export GDP to the United States, is a discounted input into all kinds of products and refined products the United States makes and sells on with profit. And when you take out that discounted input that supports billions of dollars in U.S. industry and hundreds of thousands of jobs along the value chain, actually Canada and the United States have a trade surplus in favor of the United States by over $50 billion. She hasn't been in the United States arguing for an Alberta carve-out. She's been here arguing for a Canada carve-out. So the presumption by people like Andrew and some of the talking heads on the Liberal NDP side in the Canadian press that somehow she's here kissing the ring rather than defending Canada or being Team Canada is insane. She's the only one that I can see here that's actually making the arguments that Canada should be making in a way that makes sense to the Americans and help them understand why they should take a step back and why they should be concerned that if they put these tariffs on, particularly in the case of what would happen if those tariffs hit Canadian energy, they might cause red lines in the trading indices, especially on energy. And that's something they don't want, week one of the new administration. So I think she's had an enormous effect here, positively for Canada. And that needs to be said. And the fact that it's not, I think, speaks more to the partisan dynamics of a Liberal leadership race than it does to the reality on the ground and the representation that she's been doing a lot of hard work making with meetings that the feds are completely missing in action on. And I mean, I have to tell you this, Rachel, they are invisible here.
Those tariffs, they were expected to come into effect on January 20th. That's now been delayed till February 1st. Why do you think that is?
Well, I've got some ideas. I'll tell you what I've been told because I asked about that very directly. The day that was the day that we found out that had been decided was early in the morning on the day of the inauguration, and there was a lot of buzz around it within the small community of the new administration and others around it in state and elsewhere that knew that this was pending. And he's kept almost every other thing he said he would do day one. He's done now, but he didn't do that one. And I think, and what I was told was the reason for that privately was these guys said, look, the last thing we wanted to do, understanding just how deep the resource element is and the fact that oil is a globally traded commodity with massive global trading houses, they didn't want to have a bunch of red lines hit the economy off the back of a massive tariff on Canadian energy. And one of the things that people don't understand, I don't even think most Canadians understand this, but we put 4.5 million barrels a day into the global supply chain. That's a massive amount of energy. It's almost 5% of global oil. That quantum and the fact that it almost all goes into the U.S. and goes from the U.S. out to the rest of the world is a huge sort of contingency in global energy. And that is a massive trading thing. If you put a 25% tariff on that, that is going to roil the markets. And they just didn't want to deal with that kind of disruptive economic wild card without having a very clear sense of how it would play. So right now, there are a lot of people looking at what effect will these tariffs have, particularly if they tariff energy. If you tariff the rest of the next largest component of Canada's export GDP into the United States is automobiles, car parts, and related, and that's probably about 17%. So call it, half, a little less than half of energy, and after that, it's just a series of different things. So they just didn't want to have an unexpected outcome from doing something that would particularly be globally traded. If you look at car parts, that is not going to be globally traded. You're not going to have the sovereign wealth fund of Kuwait or Qatar or the Saudis trading against that news, right? But oil, you bet, that's going to have potentially wildly disruptive effects. And I don't think they wanted to deal with that. And I do think that one of the outcomes of Danielle's full court press diplomatically here has been to alert the Americans who aren't always totally aware of the dynamics from Canada, because so much of it is hidden, that there's a significant supply into the United States that would have a massive impact on the United States export and productive capacity in energy and in energy markets. And people like Chris Wright know that, Doug Burgum know that, Rubio knows that, and she had met with all those guys in the 3 days preceding the decision to back off the tariffs. So I don't know if, you never know how much one particular argument or one particular person or diplomatic push has an impact. That's the nature of the game. But I have to say, she's been doing the right thing. And this is just my perspective, and obviously I wrote it on X. The feds are totally MIA. They're not even on the ice.
I have to ask, you mentioned that the premier was able to get all these essentially exclusive meetings in a week where people from countries all over the world are trying to get meetings with the higher ups in the Trump administration. Do you think that representatives of the federal government, whether that be bureaucrats or, Justin Trudeau, would have been able to get those meetings with, for example, Marco Rubio this week?
Look, I think the Prime Minister of Canada can get a meeting with anybody that he needs to meet with. We're an important country. We're the closest trading partner, and there's just diplomatic protocol. My frustration, Rachel, has been exactly that fact. This idea of Team Canada that's being played out, when you may not have an ideological presumption to agree with the fact that the Americans have chosen to give the Trump administration, the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives, and to have a majority on the Supreme Court. You might not like that, but that is the United States today. And your job, if you're in the federal government of Canada, is to represent the interests of Canada wearing a Canada jersey. And the fact that they are not here doing that in any obvious way that I can see, and I'm pretty close to, and I think have a pretty decent line of sight on this, to me is absolutely extraordinary, right? This is a moment for diplomacy. It's a moment to, especially when it's an event like this, where everybody is actually doing social meetings and taking these meetings. You get 15 minutes with people that are deciding the most important features of this bilateral relationship. You need to be in those meetings. You need to be having the conversation. So I find that extraordinary, number one. The other thing I find extraordinary is the one person that's doing that work, instead of being told, nice work, we're glad you're representing Alberta and Canada, she's being called out as if what she's doing is kissing the ring. So they've taken what should be a diplomatic moment and they've tried to play it in this highly partisan way. And I just think, I think the reason is so pathetic, actually. I think what they're trying to do is set up their own party, the Liberal Party of Canada, to run against Trump because they have this ideological need to motivate their base in the moment of a leadership race. Meanwhile, they've prorogued Parliament. So in a moment where we're actually facing one of the most serious economic and trade conversations with our most important trading partner, they're not even showing our most important trading partner, like the Mexicans are, in a very systematic way. Our team is missing in action, and they're not even meeting in the Parliament in Canada to show that they're putting the funding in place to secure the border. So they've made these promises, but they're not even meeting to fund them. And the Americans can see this. I mean, there are hundreds of people in state whose job it is to understand Canada, and they do. And if you hear what these guys say about our security degradation and deterioration in the last 4 years, it's savage, right? There's no other word for it. We have allowed over 1,000 people known on terror watch lists across the border in the last 4 years. That has never happened in Canadian history. 190,000 people in 2023 tried to enter illegally. They've caught over 1,000 that are already known terrorists. That's more than 90% of all terrorist interdictions into the United States from every coastline, southern border, northern border. Over 90% are coming out of Canada, resident in Canada. What does that tell you? I mean, what they're asking is, those are the ones we're catching trying to enter. How many terrorists do you have resident? How many terrorists are just hanging out in Canada waiting for their moment, you know? And what does this say about the federal government's commitment to Canadian security? By the way, and why isn't this being covered by the press? Like, I didn't know a lot of the things that I'm hearing talking to nerds in the nerds like me in the State Department or related to the security side. A good friend of mine is up for one of the Deputy Secretary of Defense roles. You know what? Why am I only hearing that now from these people? Where is this? How is this not an open debate in the Canadian press? Do we have several hundred members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps floating around Canada that they've lost control of? The Americans know it, and we only designated them a terrorist organization in the summer. And you know, and the U.S. is saying, fix this or you will face tariffs. And our federal team as prorogued Parliament can't meet to make any of those commitments. They're talking about buying helicopters. Helicopters will help, but that is not the solution. The source code problem that we've got is asylum fraud, immigration fraud, years of underfunding NATO, years of making our military woke, years of making our law enforcement ineffective, and constantly concerned about how certain things appear instead of actually doing the job of protecting Canadians, number one, and then also protecting our borders so the Americans don't reach a point where they say, we've had enough, you're going to face tariffs unless you fix it. The fact that that is the reason the Americans have given for the tariff threat, and the only response from the feds has been, let's all sign a document saying we'll use Alberta resources as the number one way to fight back without fixing the underlying problem, is crazy to me.
You know, it's really interesting because over the last number of weeks, I've had a number of discussions with people who are saying, oh, you know, the Americans do want Canada to beef up security, but that isn't what this is really about. This is more, you know, the art of the deal, Trump trying to rattle, you know, Canadian leaders and politicians. But it sounds like you're saying, truthfully, it is security. That's actually what the issues are. It's exactly what Trump said it was.
Look, you know, I think, you know, when you see, Rachel, you know, when you see a single talking point repeat itself 20 times with different people and different media heads and different, you know, the single talking point I keep seeing whenever I look at Canadian media, and I've been overseas for most of the last month and a bit, but is everything is on the table, right? Everything's on the table. And I don't know how this vapid, ridiculous truism has suddenly become like some serious talking point. There's nothing serious about it. The table got set November 25th when the incoming president of the United States said, we have a fundamental problem with the lack of security on the northern border. It's identical in the kind of problems that we see in the southern border. We won't allow it to persist. If you don't shift it, change it, and show how you're changing it, and by the way, you've been terrible at it for years, then we will have these tariffs, right? We've got put on notice, right? And what did we do about it for 2 months? I'd love to know. You know, and instead of having a coherent response and that saying, this is what we're going to do about NATO and the fact that we've been a deadbeat freeloader on NATO, and we know we have Russian subs floating off our Arctic, and you've been furious about that, and we just haven't done anything about it. This is what we're going to do on our problem of our underfunded military and our incapability of delivering on core commitments we have in NORAD and NATO. Haven't even been invited to AUKUS. This is what we're going to do about our open asylum fraud. This is what we're going to do about the fact that we have this top sponsor of global terror, the IRGC. We have several hundred of those guys, senior people floating around our country that we haven't been able to track. And we know that, right? This is what we're going to do about our immigration fraud and the fact that a ton of our student visas, tens of thousands, don't even have people showing up at the schools they ostensibly came in here for, right? This is what we're going to do about the fentanyl super labs. This is what we're going to do about the 1,000 terrorists, the over 90% of the terrorists who've been interdicting. Where are the federal response to these issues? You say everything's on the table. Well, number one, the table was set November 25th, and you haven't responded to anything on that table right? The Americans put it on the table. Number two, the table is in DC right now, and no one that's got a mandate to respond to those issues is showing up. They're all invisible, right? So what are we doing? So the idea that this is sort of, and then third, the person that is showing up, doing her job, representing the thing that's within her jurisdiction, which is energy, which belongs to Alberta, is being catcalled by everybody else for actually being on the ice, doing the work and grinding in the corners and getting the meetings and trying to represent this case. And she's making a Team Canada case, saying you discount energy and you actually have a trade surplus, right? So you watch that when you're sort of, I'm not actively involved again, but I care a lot about these issues. I have clients that care a lot about these issues. And I'm here and I've got good friends frankly, on both sides of the aisle, but good friends that are coming to this administration. And you see that and you just think, look, we have become a deeply unserious country. If you think everything's on the table, if you're saying that in CTV or CBC, right, then I think it's the responsibility of CTV and CBC to say, okay, everything's on the table. Let's look at what the Americans put on the table. Here's the 10 things that they say we've been failing at. What do you say about those? What's your plan? Right? Now tell me what your response is, because unless you can respond to those things coherently, you're not even at the table or near the table. So don't pretend that you've got some negotiating insight.
David, wow, thank you so much for your insight. We have to leave it there for today, but I really appreciate that.
Thanks for letting me go off on this. It's incredible to have these meetings, and I think Danielle's doing a good job. Thanks for putting some true North information out there.
Hey everyone, and now I am joined by Alberta's Mental Health and Addictions Minister, Dan Williams. As you guys know, I've covered what's called Alberta's recovery-oriented system of care. They've really been prioritizing treatment over safe supply, like we're seeing in other provinces, like our neighbor to the west of us over in BC. And they've been pretty roundly criticized for this approach, but it looks like it is finally paying off with some of the numbers that are coming out of the province. Minister Williams, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm just going to let you really dive into it. What are the latest that we're seeing in numbers on the ground resulting from Alberta's approach?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. The numbers are becoming more and more clear. We've seen a year-over-year drop from 2023 to 2024 of 38% decrease in opioid fatalities. Now, this is huge news, not least of which because these are lives saved, Albertans, family members, community members of ours that we know now are being helped, many of them getting access to recovery in Alberta, which wasn't possible before the United Conservatives came in because no one was building addiction treatment spaces. It's still not possible in jurisdictions next door, like you mentioned in British Columbia, which is focused on what's known as a harm reduction model and makes itself manifest in unsafe supply, in drug consumption sites on every street corner, in public and safety, and all of that compiles into seeing the same kind of numbers you see across the rest of Canada and the United States. It's approximately an 8% decrease in British Columbia when it comes to opioid fatality reduction, which is what everywhere is seen because post-COVID we're seeing that drop. We're 4 times higher drop in Alberta. I'm very, very optimistic, cautiously so, that we're going to continue to see this system prove itself in the evidence and the data. It's becoming abundantly clear that harm reduction has become harm production under programs like Unsafe Supply, and that it's their Alberta Recovery model that is about dignity and hope and healthcare for those suffering from addiction that is actually leading the way and getting real results. And you see it. You see it in your communities. You see it when you look for people who are trying to get access to treatment. And increasingly, we're seeing it in the data.
Now, I know that the United Conservative Party government has made pretty significant investments in this model. I think when I last covered this, it was a while ago, there was something like 11 centers being built in total. Could you give us an update on how many centers your government has actually built?
So we have a center built in Red Deer, in Lethbridge, and in Gunn, Alberta, which is on Lac St. Anne, just outside of Edmonton. We have more facilities opening up this year, another 4 more opening up this year. And we're partnering with Indigenous community. We're going to have a total of 11 recovery communities. And on top of that, I also know that we need to care for those suffering from addiction. And there are a number of people who suffer in the worst throes of addiction, trapped imprisoned by the addiction, they're the individuals that you see on the street in Jasper Avenue or on Stephen Avenue, or in towns like I'm from, Peace River, increasingly in our rural communities, that are intermittently homeless, that have lost personal agency, that some of them, because they're speedballing methamphetamine along with fentanyl, are fencing with the wind with a huge syringe out front of the rec center as mom and kids are trying to get in. There's nothing compassionate about leaving those individuals to stay intermittently homeless, to risk overdose. We had one individual that overdosed 186 times that we know of with our provincial healthcare records. 186 time overdose. Each one of those overdoses is one breath away from death. There's nothing compassionate about leaving our family members and friends in that state. So we're going to be introducing the compassionate intervention legislation, where if you're a danger to yourself or others, like that 186 time overdoser, we don't want that 187th time to end up in death. And so what we're going to do is intervene, and potentially, if we meet the very high standard, then there will be a mandatory treatment order that could come out of that to help that individual suffering from addiction where everything has been offered, to get that person help and health care, but then also to restore safety to the community so that the people fencing with the wind with the used syringe, risking public insecurity to family members, to school groups, to those that we love and care for that ride public transit, to return that back to the city, back to Albertans.
Obviously, we're just coming off the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know that a number of Albertans still have concerns about the vaccine coercion that we saw during that era. What would your response be to those Albertans who are unsettled by the sort of mandatory treatment that your government is looking to pass through legislation?
I say that's a legitimate concern to be thoughtful and to react if there is an overreach of government. I was very concerned about overreach of government in the past, and I think that's legitimate. But I'll say we're putting our money where our mouth is. We passed the Alberta Bill of Human Rights Amendment to make sure, the Alberta Bill of Rights Amendment, to make sure that it's protected in Alberta law when it comes to civil liberties and personal liberties. This is not about overreach. This is about returning your communities to Albertans. This is about helping those who are in addiction. I can tell you now, Rachel, if it was your daughter or my son that was suffering from addiction and everything had been tried and your daughter or my son was overdosing 186 times, we would want society to be able to intervene compassionately, to intervene with a response that brings someone into healing again, bring them into an opportunity of recovery. Every Albertan deserves an opportunity of recovery if they're in addiction. And if it's your daughter or my son, we know that addiction, run its course, given enough time, tragically, it ends in only one of two ways. It ends in pain, misery, and with enough of a runway, it ends in death. Or the alternative is it ends in some sort of intervention, treatment, recovery, and a second lease on life. That's what I want to see for my family members and friends and loved ones and every Alberta citizen that is struggling if every other opportunity has been extended to them and they are danger in some way to cause harm to themselves or others, then yes, that's the conservative, thoughtful, compassionate Canadian and Albertan approach, is to care for them.
You were in Washington in September to talk about the Alberta model. I'm wondering if there are states that are looking at Alberta and hoping to mimic the recovery-oriented system of care that we have here.
It's pretty interesting. We're seeing a lot of interest across the United States. I myself am going to Washington in about 2 weeks for the National Prayer Breakfast, and we're having meetings as well with officials to talk about the Alberta model with this incoming Republican administration about how we can share our best practices in Alberta with a recovery-oriented system of care, with that Alberta Recovery model with them. And also, we've had Massachusetts and Connecticut very interested. We've had other states and state legislators in the Midwest and the Southwest interested in what Alberta's doing. The pandemic of addiction, opioid overdose that we see across Canada and in our cities, it's happening in the United States as well. Now, we had a federal government that poured jet fuel to create a dumpster fire when they put unsafe supply on the streets, dumping 100 million pills of hydromorphone 5 times more powerful than heroin, unwitnessed into the supply of opioids. And we've had horrible policy where they think drug consumption sites on every street corner is going to solve an addiction crisis without any prevention, early intervention, and no attempt at recovery. Of course, that's going to make it worse in Canada. The United States also faces fundamentally the same problem around lots of supply of high-powered opioids like fentanyl, and lots of demand created by a reckless pharmaceutical industry that pushed on unsuspecting Canadians and Americans a pernicious and incredibly cynical plot for profit to have millions upon millions of our citizens addicted to the deadliest drugs on the planet. And so they have that same fundamental setting that drove us to this crisis in the United States as Canada. Thankfully, their governments have not had the same kind of response the Trudeau Liberals have had, where they've made it even worse. But the problem's still there. And so they're very interested in what Alberta's doing, because in some ways, we're further down the line than they are in terms of having to come up with a response, because our crisis is more mature than theirs is.
When you talk about this trip to Washington, it will come obviously in the midst of a looming trade war. At the time you'll be in Washington, it's likely that we'll see those 25% tariffs that are currently set to take effect on February 1st. Obviously, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has really been leveraging herself and trying to build relationships with her American counterparts in hopes of securing a deal for, all of Canada, if not at least Alberta. Do you think that your endeavor down to Washington and your, speaking with counterparts there, are you hoping to leverage that at all to build those relationships and potentially solidify an exemption for, Alberta as these tariffs come into place, or are you not focused on that at this time?
Absolutely, I want to build relationships, and I'm incredibly proud of the work Premier Smith has done in trying to find a de-escalation and a common solution to our largest trading partner to the south. I'm an incredibly proud Canadian. I'd like to see this solved without any kind of tariffs put on either side. I think that's the net benefit to all of us, to show a stronger North America with 2 independent countries side by side. But I'd also like to see a federal government that doesn't make this unity crisis worse. They have no legitimacy, and they're telling us in Alberta what we need to do with our resources. I think that the hypocrisy and the condescension coming from the Trudeau Liberals is outrageous, accusing us of being un-Canadian, effectively saying that we're unpatriotic because we want to see a de-escalation of a potential trade war with the world's largest economic superpower and our largest trading partner. Where have they been for the last decade, calling us un-Canadian, not on Team Canada? They've been destroying Canada in every opportunity they could, leaving our flags at half-mast for a year, attacking John A. Macdonald and his legacy, who founded this country, tearing down his statues, putting them under boxes for 5 years on end. They've done everything they can, including Trudeau saying we're a post-national state. Well, the culture they set in Ottawa has consequences, and unfortunately, they can't turn on a dime and say that we've been un-Canadian when they're the ones that seem to hate the very country that has given them all the benefits and prosperity that we inherit today. So no, I'm a proud Canadian. I don't think the problem is with Alberta here. I think we're doing the right job trying to build relationships in Washington. I'll continue to do so. I'm incredibly ashamed of a federal government that tries to pit Alberta and province against province, that tries to condescend and take advantage of the very resources that they're trying to shut down when it's convenient for them to do so. All of a sudden it's Canadian oil or Canadian energy rather than Alberta oil. It's no longer dirty, but an important part of our trade negotiations. I can tell you, just as my position as an Albertan, if nothing else, I'm a proud Canadian, but incredibly disappointed at the cynical approach of the Trudeau Liberal cabinet. I've had enough Eastern politicians dictating to us what we need to do with our oil, whether it's keep it in the ground or use it to cause trade wars that make all of us poorer.
Minister, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, everyone, that is all we have time for today. I hope that you enjoyed those interviews. Thought it was worthwhile to do an update on the Alberta Recovery model because I've covered that story a lot over my career. And you guys know that I'm really fascinated by the trade war with the United States. It was so great to have a perspective from someone who has those contacts in Washington and who was on the ground for the inauguration. Hope that you guys have a great rest of your week. God bless.